In 1987, a passenger plane vanished without a trace during a storm over remote forest land. The crash site was eventually found burned, twisted metal, and charred bodies. No one survived. One man on that flight, Richard Hyde, was presumed dead like the rest. But in 2007, after a terrible flood swept through a nearby farm just 20 miles from the crash site, a metal container was uncovered, buried deep in the earth. Inside, there were personal belongings, a torn-up photo, and a disturbing note scribbled in smudged ink. Don't trust the pilot. This story unfolds from the moments before the crash, until the truth surfaces piece by piece. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today, and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Richard Hyde hated flying. He always said airports were nothing but chaos disguised as order. But that October morning in 1987, he had no choice. The Seattle conference had been mandatory, and now he was headed back home to Colorado Springs. His ticket was for Flight 1678, a small regional plane scheduled to fly over the Rockies just before nightfall. The Denver departure gate was crowded, mostly business people like him. Richard was a 37-year-old mechanical engineer, sharp, cautious, and not easily rattled. He'd kissed his wife, Angela, goodbye just 2 days earlier. Now he clutched a leather briefcase with patent drafts and a disposable camera he'd used to photograph blueprint models at the conference. The pilot, a man named Captain Felix Morrow, stood near the boarding ramp chatting with one of the crew. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing aviator glasses even indoors. Something about his posture struck Richard as too relaxed, not careless, but smug. Like a man hiding something, Richard felt uneasy. As the passengers boarded, he overheard a heated exchange between two airline employees. Something about weight distribution, shifting cargo last minute. The plane was a small twin-engine turboprop, not built to handle excess baggage. Richard didn't think much of it until the turbulence started. 30 minutes into the flight, as the plane passed over rugged forests near the Wyoming border, the weather shifted violently. Black clouds swarmed the sky, lightning slashed in the distance, and the plane rocked sideways. People screamed. The lights flickered. Then came the bang, metallic and deep, from the back of the plane. "Everyone stay calm," a stewardess shouted. "Fasten your seatbelts," the plane dropped suddenly. A jolt hit the left wing. Richard grabbed his seat arms so hard his knuckles went pale. He looked out the small oval window. The ground was coming up fast. Smoke, shouts, screaming metal, blackout. Somewhere in the dense forest, the wreckage burned. A search team arrived 3 days later after satellite reports picked up an unusual heat signature. The scene was horrifying, charred fuselage, bodies still strapped to seats. They counted every passenger, every crew member. They declared no survivors, but they were wrong. 10 miles away, Richard Hyde woke up in a stream bed, his shirt soaked in blood. He could barely move. His head throbbed. A jagged metal shard was sticking out of his thigh. He couldn't remember how he got there, only the last image burned into his memory. Captain Morrow's eyes in the rearview mirror, so staring straight back as the plane went down. Why hadn't the captain tried to pull up? Richard dragged himself up the hill. It took him all day. He found no plane, no people, just trees and silence. His watch was gone, his briefcase gone. Only a torn piece of his shirt and the fire still rising in the distance told him it was real. But the smoke wasn't from a crash site anymore. It had moved. He limped through the woods for 2 more days, living on creek water and berries. On the 3rd night, he stumbled across something he couldn't explain, a half-buried metal container hidden beneath dry leaves. It wasn't part of the wreckage. It looked like it had been buried years ago. Richard was too weak to open it then. He made a mark on a nearby tree and kept moving. On the 5th day, he found a cabin. That's when everything went sideways. Inside the cabin, there was light, lanterns, supplies, maps, radio gear, and a single handgun on the table. A man in uniform stood near the fire. He wasn't a park ranger. "Don't move," the man said, pointing the gun. Richard froze. "You're supposed to be dead," the man muttered. "None of you were supposed to walk away from that crash." "What the hell are you talking about?" Richard croaked. You weren't on the list, the man said, cocking the hammer. Now I've got a problem, Richard lunged. The gun went off. Pain screamed in his side. He crashed into the man, grabbing the weapon, both of them tumbling into the wooden table. It cracked beneath them. The lantern fell, lighting the floor ablaze. Richard didn't remember what happened next, only that when he woke again, the cabin was in flames, the man was gone, and the radio was crushed. He knew then this crash wasn't an accident. Somehow he wasn't just a survivor, he was a witness, and someone didn't want him to talk. He crawled out of the fire, took the handgun, and fled into the woods again. The metal container, he had to find it. That's where the truth started. Richard didn't know how long he had been walking again. His side was bleeding where the bullet had grazed him, and every step felt like dragging a dead leg. But the forest was too quiet now. No birds, no wind, nothing, just the low hum of fear growing in his chest. He had one thing on his mind, the metal container. That man at the cabin, he had said something strange. You weren't on the list. What list? The flight manifest? The kill list? Richard didn't care anymore. His breath came in short bursts, his shirt damp with sweat and blood. His gun felt heavy in his hand, and every time a twig snapped behind him, he turned, ready to fire. But there was no one, only trees. Then finally, he saw the tree he marked with his fingernail and the small stone pile he built to hide the container. He dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands. Dirt packed beneath his nails. His fingers were raw. But soon the edge of the container revealed itself. It was metal, scratched up and heavier than it looked. He popped it open. Inside were documents. Maps, flight logs, a notebook, and photos, black and white photos of people. Some in suits, some in military uniforms. And then he saw it, a photo of the pilot, Captain Felix Morrow, shaking hands with one of the men from the cabin. What the hell? The notebook was filled with scribbles. Coordinates, names. There was even mention of Flight 1678 circled in red. One line made his heart stop. Test flight successful. No civilian witnesses expected to survive. Pilot extraction confirmed. Richard sat back in the dirt, the wind knocked out of him. It was planned. The crash was no accident. He flipped to the last page. A single sentence had been scratched in with shaky handwriting. Don't trust the pilot. Suddenly, Richard heard something in the distance. Not an animal, engines, low and slow, like a vehicle moving through mud. He grabbed the container, wrapped it in what was left of his shirt, and ran. He found an old fire road leading out of the forest. His legs almost gave out, but he pushed forward, half limping, half running. Then he saw it. An old pickup truck moving up the dirt road toward him. He waved frantically. The truck slowed. An older man with sun-baked skin and a plaid shirt rolled down the window. Jesus, you look like you crawled out of hell. You all right? Richard nodded quickly. I need to get out of here. Someone's trying to kill me. Hop in, the man said without hesitation. They drove in silence for a while. Richard kept looking behind them. The woods swallowed the road. You military? The old man asked finally. No, Richard said. I was in a plane crash. 5 days ago. The man's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. Flight 1678? Richard's head snapped toward him. You heard about it? Everyone did. Whole country's talking about it. News says nobody survived. They're wrong, Richard said. They're lying. He pulled the container out from under his feet and popped it open on his lap. The old man looked at the contents, then back at the road. He didn't speak for a while. Then he simply said, That's why they're hunting you. They drove for 2 hours before the truck stopped near a general store with a working payphone. Richard got out. You call the wrong person, the old man warned, and they'll trace it. Richard nodded. Thanks for the ride. He used the payphone to call Angela, his wife. But the line went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same thing. Something wasn't right. He called a trusted colleague from work, a guy named Ben Harper. Ben, it's me, Richard said. Who? Ben asked, Who is this? It's Richard Hyde. There was a long pause, then a low voice. That's not funny. Richard's dead. No, listen to me. I survived. But they're covering it up. That crash, Ben, it wasn't an accident. Silence. Then Ben whispered, Where are you? I don't know. Someplace off Route 82. I have proof. I need help. I'll meet you, Ben said. Give me an hour. Richard waited inside the store. He didn't touch anything. He didn't trust anyone. He sat by the window, watching every car that passed. Then a black SUV pulled up. It wasn't Ben. 3 men got out, tactical vests. No baches. One held a suppressed pistol close to his side. The cashier didn't even look up. Richard ducked behind a shelf and crawled toward the back exit. He clutched the container, heart pounding. One wrong step and he was dead. One of the men entered the store. Description matches, might still be inside, the man said. Richard held his breath as Boots walked past the next aisle. Then, without thinking, he burst through the back door and ran. He heard shouts behind him, then gunfire. Bullets splintered the wood beside him as he dove behind a dumpster. He fired back blindly with the handgun he took from the cabin. One man cried out, tires screeched. He sprinted across the back lot and disappeared into the woods behind the building. His heart was thumping in his ears, his lungs burned. But he kept running. Somehow they had tracked his call, or maybe Ben had tipped them off. Richard didn't know who to trust anymore. The container pressed against his ribs with every step. That metal box was his only proof. It held everything, the note, the photo, the flight log. It was why they were chasing him. He needed to disappear, and fast. By midnight he reached an abandoned ranger station deep in the woods. Dust covered the walls, but the lock was broken. He crept inside and bolted the door. He lit a small candle and laid out the documents. There were codes he didn't understand. But one entry stood out. If passenger resists, initiate secondary protocol. Make it look like weather interference. They had prepared for resistance. What had he been part of? Richard leaned back and stared at the flickering flame. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't go home. He wasn't just a survivor now. He was a target. And somewhere out there, Captain Morrow was still alive. Richard barely slept that night. Inside the abandoned ranger station, he sat with his back to the door, the gun in his lap, and the metal container under his arm. He had a map now taken from the box. It was old, marked with strange flight paths and red circles. One of the circled spots wasn't far from where he was hiding, a location labeled Base Echo. He didn't know what it was, but something deep inside told him it had answers. By dawn, he was already on the move. His side throbbed with every step. He had torn some cloth from an old curtain and tied it around his waist to stop the bleeding. The forest was thick, but he stayed low off the trails, listening for any signs of movement. Twice, he thought he heard the hum of drones in the sky. He pressed forward. After 4 hours, he found a set of old railroad tracks, rusty, broken in places, overgrown with weeds. They pointed east toward Base Echo, according to the map. He followed the tracks. Half a mile down, he spotted something strange, a body. A man, dressed in black, face down in the brush, half covered with leaves. Richard's heart sank. He stepped closer, holding the gun steady. The man wasn't just any hiker. He wore a radio pack, black gloves, and a silenced pistol strapped to his thigh. His throat had been cut, fresh. Richard crouched, looking around the woods. Whoever had done this could still be close. Then he saw it, boot prints, 2 sets, one large. One smaller, lighter. Someone else was running too. Richard didn't wait. He took the radio, the gun, and a small pocket knife from the man's gear. Then he kept walking. Whoever else was out here might know more than he did, and they were also being hunted. By late afternoon, the sky turned dark. Clouds gathered again, heavy with rain. Richard pressed forward until he reached a clearing and what looked like an abandoned airfield. Cracked runways, a rusted hangar, faded signs half swallowed by vines. Base Echo, the gates were broken. No guards, no cameras. Just silence and the wind pushing against the crumpled chain-link fences. Richard ducked inside the hangar. It was mostly empty, but in one corner beneath a tarp he found something unexpected, a military jeep, old but intact. He climbed in. The keys were in the ignition. He turned them slowly. It started. "Thank you," he muttered. He checked the glove compartment. A folded paper map, a half-empty bottle of water, and under the seat a dusty black case. Inside, a second pistol, 2 loaded magazines, and a pair of night vision goggles. He took everything. If this place had been abandoned, it hadn't been for long. He searched the hangar office next. Inside were rows of filing cabinets, some still locked. He forced one open with the pocket knife. Dozens of flight logs marked with military codes. Several had the same flight numbers as the one Richard had been on, 1678, but with different dates, some stretching back years. This wasn't a one-time mission. It had been done before, over and over. He snapped photos with a disposable camera he found in the drawer. His hands were shaking now. Behind him, a creek. He spun gun raised. A woman stood in the doorway, dirt-stained and out of breath. Maybe mid-30s, brown ponytail. Sharp eyes. She had a rifle slung over her shoulder. She froze when she saw him. "Don't shoot," she said, raising her hands. "Who are you?" Richard asked. "Name's Tessa. I was on the search team for Flight 1678. I know who you are." Richard didn't lower the gun. "You with them?" "If I was, you'd be dead already," she said flatly. "I've been running for 2 days." He watched her. She didn't flinch. "I saw you in one of the photos," she said. "They have a file on you. They're hunting you because you lived." Richard lowered the gun, just slightly. "How did you find this place?" She stepped inside. "Same way you did. I found a map. Same box, probably." "You found a container, too?" She nodded. Buried near a ridge, it had photos. Logs, warnings, same handwriting. "Don't trust the pilot." Richard exhaled, finally feeling like he wasn't alone anymore. "We need to get out of here," she said. "If they know you've been here, they'll send a cleanup team." Richard pointed to the Jeep. "Got wheels." "Then let's move." They loaded the files and supplies into the Jeep. As they pulled out onto a dirt road leading deeper into the valley, Richard asked, "Who are they?" Tessa gripped the steering wheel. "Some kind of shadow unit. Off-the-books government contractors. The crash was part of an experiment. They're testing flight paths, cargo response, maybe even weapons drops. And they use real passengers? They make the flights look routine. Then they vanish. No one asks questions when storms are involved." Richard stared ahead. His knuckles were white. "They want silence," she continued. "You're a leak." "So are you." She glanced at him. "Yeah, but I'm done running." Suddenly, headlights flashed ahead. A black SUV blocked the road. Another appeared behind them. Tessa slammed the brakes. Men stepped out. Guns raised. Richard grabbed the pistol and kicked the door open, using it as cover. Shots exploded through the trees. Tessa fired from her side, dropping one of the shooters. Richard aimed and took out a second. The SUV behind them sped closer. "Go," Tessa shouted. Richard jumped in and slammed the gear forward. The Jeep roared past the first SUV, bouncing hard over the side trail. Bullets shattered the back window. "Left," she yelled. They swerved through a narrow dirt road, tires slipping in the mud. More shots chased them through the trees. But they were moving too fast. Eventually, the gunfire faded behind them. Silence returned. Richard could barely breathe. His hands shook on the steering wheel. Tessa clutched her rifle, blood on her sleeve. "We can't keep running like this," Richard said. "We need to expose this." "We will," she replied. "But not until we know where to strike." She opened the map. "There's one more site listed. A storage facility, underground, 40 miles north. You think it's got answers?" "I think it's got everything," Richard nodded, pressing the pedal harder. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a threat, and now he had a partner. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. The road ahead was rough, barely more than a trail through the trees. The Jeep rattled and groaned with every bump, but Richard kept his eyes forward, gripping the wheel like his life depended on it. Tessa sat beside him, map unfolded in her lap. Her face was tight with focus. "According to this," she said, tracing a line with her finger, "we're heading toward a government-owned land parcel, marked inactive since the early 80s. "Storage facility?" Richard asked. "Looks like it, but not the kind that holds office supplies." They drove in silence for a few minutes. The woods outside were thick. Shadows crept between the trees, and every snap of a branch sent adrenaline spiking through Richard's chest. "Why do you think they keep trying to erase these crashes?" he asked suddenly. "Because people ask questions," Tessa said. "A regular crash with no survivors. Tragic. But someone surviving with documents and photos that prove it wasn't an accident? That's dangerous, especially if someone digs too deep." "And the pilot?" Richard pressed. Captain Morrow. If he survived, where is he? Tessa didn't answer right away. I think he was never supposed to die, she said. I think he was pulled out before impact. That's what those logs mean by pilot extraction confirmed. Richard gritted his teeth. Then we find him. By dusk, they arrived at the location on the map. The jeep came to a stop in front of what looked like a crumbling concrete entrance built into the side of a hill. Overgrown vines and moss nearly covered the metal door, but it was there, clearly man-made. A rusted sign nearby read, "Authorized personnel only." Tessa got out first, rifle in hand. She moved carefully, checking the area. No cameras, no motion sensors. Richard followed her. They approached the door and found a keypad, dead and corroded. Tessa knelt and pulled a small screwdriver from her bag. "You can break into that?" he asked. "Spent a few years on recon missions. You learn how to improvise." She popped the panel open and twisted 2 wires together. Sparks a hiss, the lock clicked. She smirked. "Let's find your answers." Inside, the air was thick and stale. Their footsteps echoed down the long, narrow corridor lined with old fluorescent lights, most of them dead. Tessa flicked on a flashlight. The beam swept across walls stained with water and time. Dust swirled in the air. They walked in silence, moving deeper into the belly of the structure. Around a corner they found an old elevator shaft. The doors were open. The elevator was at the bottom. "Climb down?" Richard asked. Tessa nodded, pulling out rope from her bag. "Looks like we don't have a choice." They descended one at a time, boots scraping against the shaft wall. The rope groaned but held steady. At the bottom, they found themselves in another hallway. This one was colder, lined with steel doors, some open, others sealed shut. Tessa tried the first one. It creaked open. Inside, metal shelves stacked with boxes. Labeled by code, she opened one. Files, black and white photos. Maps. Richard stepped in and grabbed a file. His name was on the tab. "Wait, this is me," he said, flipping it open. "My job history, my travel records. Even a copy of my last will." Tessa checked another box. They had files on every passenger. She pulled out another folder. "Angela Hyde. Your wife?" Richard snatched it from her. Inside were surveillance photos. Angela at home, at the grocery store, even at the airport the day Richard left for his flight. "They were watching her," he muttered, "even after the crash." "This goes deeper than just one flight," Tessa said. "They've been running these operations for decades." Richard turned to her. "We leak this. We go public. We destroy them." Tessa hesitated. "Not yet. If we go too early, they'll kill it in the press. We need something they can't bury." Another hallway caught Richard's eye. The sign above read, "Flight Operations Archive." He and Tessa moved down the hall, finding a heavy steel door at the end. It had a fingerprint scanner, dead from age. But the hinges were old. Richard jammed the butt of his gun into the joint. It took 5 hits. Then the door creaked and buckled open. Inside, a room lit by soft emergency lights. Rows of servers blinking faintly, still humming with power. A table in the center held dozens of black cassette tapes, labeled with dates and codes. Tessa picked one up, Flight 1678. Cockpit voice recorder. Richard stared at it. "That's the black box recording," he said. "That's everything." They scanned the room and found a tape player wired to an old terminal. Tessa loaded the tape. The audio crackled. "This is Flight 1678, ready for takeoff. Static. Altitude holding, turbulence ahead." More static, then a voice, calm, confident. "Execute protocol. Passenger status, unaware. Prepare extraction." Another voice replied. "Extraction window confirmed. Countdown begins now." Richard froze. "They never planned to land that plane," Tessa said. The tape continued, a faint alarm. Screams, then silence, then one last voice, "Captain Morrow. Mission complete. Beginning secondary phase." The tape ended. Richard sat back. His throat was dry. His hands shook. "That's it," he said. "That's the proof." But before they could celebrate, Tessa turned sharply, her head tilted. "You hear that?" A soft hum, then footsteps. "Get down," she whispered, pulling him behind a rack of tapes. 3 men entered, dressed in tactical black, rifles raised, their voices low and clipped. "Tracker says they came in through the north wall. We find them, we kill them, burn the room." Richard raised his pistol. Tessa whispered, "Wait for them to spread out." One of the men moved down the aisle toward them. His boot crunched glass on the floor. He turned and met Richard's gun. Richard fired once, clean shot to the chest. Tessa moved fast, swinging the butt of her rifle into another's jaw. He dropped. The third turned to shoot, but Richard tackled him, slamming his head against the server cabinet. All three were down. Tessa exhaled. They knew we'd come here. Richard grabbed the tape. Then we're running out of time. She nodded. Let's move. They loaded files, tapes, and the backup drive from the server room into a crate they could carry. Back at the elevator shaft, they climbed up one by one, slower this time. Richard's hands slipped, but he made it. At the top, just as they pushed open the exit door, a shot rang out. The bullet shattered the door frame next to Richard's head. Go, 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 Tessa yelled. They sprinted through the trees, ducking behind logs and dodging branches. More shots behind them. Whoever was chasing them wasn't just trying to silence them anymore. They were trying to erase them. The forest swallowed their footsteps as Richard and Tessa tore through the underbrush. Gunfire cracked behind them. The sound echoed through the trees like thunder. They didn't stop to look back. They couldn't. Richard clutched the crate of files to his chest, the weight threatening to slow him down. But he wouldn't let go. That box was everything now. It held the cockpit recording, classified files, passenger surveillance documents, the truth. Tessa led the way, ducking low, weaving through the thick branches. We're a mile out from the jeep, she shouted. They'll be waiting for it, Richard yelled back. Then we steal theirs. They veered right toward where the black SUVs had been parked outside the facility. As they approached the clearing, Tessa raised her hand and dropped flat to the ground. Richard followed, breathing hard. Two guards stood by the vehicles, scanning the woods. Tessa crawled beside him, voice low. We take one clean and quiet, then we roll the dice, Richard nodded. Left one's mine. They moved slowly, using the thick grass for cover. Tessa reached the first man and struck fast, grabbing his collar, yanking him back, and smashing the butt of her rifle into his face. He collapsed silently. Richard's man turned, but too late. Richard drove his shoulder into him, slamming him against the SUV. A quick punch to the throat dropped him. They dragged the bodies into the woods. Tessa jumped into the driver's seat of the closest SUV and hot-wired it in under 30 seconds. Richard tossed the crate into the back and climbed in. Tires kicked up dust as they peeled out of the clearing, headlights off. Behind them, more shots rang out, missed by seconds. They were gone. Back on the highway, Richard stared at the road ahead. The sun was dipping low again, casting orange light across the hills. Tessa kept the speed steady. They won't stop. Not now. We've got more than just proof. We've got the full picture. Richard turned toward her. So what do? We can't just walk into a police station and hand this over. They'd never believe us, she said. Not until we show them something they can't deny in front of millions of people. Richard's mind raced. What about the press? She shook her head. They'll bury it. The right media won't even touch this unless someone forces it live. What are you saying? I know a guy. Lives in Boulder. Ex-military, now runs a pirate broadcast network. Underground. He's been exposing dirty government deals for years. If anyone can push this out raw, unfiltered, it's him. Richard gripped the seat. Then we go to Boulder. They drove through the night, switching vehicles once at a truck stop to avoid being tracked. The second SUV was ditched off a back road, and Tessa paid cash for a used pickup from a farmer who didn't ask questions. By morning, they were just outside Boulder. The mountains loomed in the distance like silent giants. Tessa directed Richard to a rundown cabin off a side road, hidden by tall pine trees. Here, she said. They parked behind the cabin and knocked 3 times. The door creaked open to reveal a stocky man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a beard like iron wire. Tessa, he asked. Hey, Carl. His gaze shifted to Richard. And him? Survivor of Flight 1678. Carl stepped aside. Get in. Inside, the cabin was wired wall to wall with monitors, radios, and satellite equipment. Carl ran a full operation from this forgotten place in the woods. Richard placed the crate on the table. Carl opened it and stared for a long time. Holy hell, he muttered. This is real. He picked up the cockpit tape and played a portion of it. The voice came through, execute protocol. Passenger status, unaware, prepare extraction. Carl's face turned pale. I've seen a lot of crap in my time, but this is another level. You can push it live, Tessa asked. Yeah, but not from here, Carl said. Signal strength's too weak. We'd need to piggyback off a satellite line at one of the comm towers. Closest one's 20 miles north. Richard sighed. Then we drive. Not that easy, Carl said. That place is guarded. Government keeps it manned for weather and emergency broadcasts. You'll need to sneak in and hook up the drive directly. Richard looked at Tessa. We've come this far. She nodded. Let's finish it. They left at dusk. Carl handed them forged ID badges, a backpack full of gear, and a small encrypted laptop connected to a preloaded satellite key. If you make it in, Carl said, you'll have 15 minutes to plug in and broadcast before they trace it. What happens after that? Richard asked. Carl shrugged. Run. They parked a mile out from the tower. The facility looked like any utility building, fenced in, tall antennas blinking red, a small brick structure underneath. One security guard at the front gate. Tessa scoped it with binoculars. We go in through the back fence. Cut the wire, slip past the generators, and into the main server room. Richard took a deep breath. Let's go. They moved fast, sticking to the tree line, cutting through brush. When they reached the fence, Tessa clipped the wire and peeled it open just enough for them to crawl through. They passed under the humming generators, avoiding the floodlights. Inside the building, they found the control room. Small, cold, packed with wires and blinking routers. Richard connected the drive to the main port. The screen lit up. Uploading data, 5%, Tessa kept watch at the hallway. 10 minutes max, she whispered. The screen ticked up slowly, 10%, 20%, 30%. Then footsteps outside the hallway. Someone's coming, Tessa hissed. Richard didn't move. Keep him out. She stepped into the hall and raised her pistol. The guard appeared with a flashlight. Who's in there? Tessa flashed her fake badge. System check from Central. The guard squinted. Didn't hear anything about that. Probably above your pay grade, she said coldly. The guard hesitated. Then from inside the room, Richard shouted, 90%. Tessa raised the gun. The guard saw it. He reached for his radio, too slow. She struck his wrist and forced him down. He hit the wall with a grunt and slumped over. Done, Richard yelled. We're live. He grabbed the drive. They sprinted out the back, alarms now wailing. Guards shouted. Flashlights danced through the trees. They ran. Bullets snapped branches beside them. They didn't stop. The truth was out. And now the world would see everything. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. By the time Richard and Tessa reached the highway again, their legs burned and lungs felt like fire. They had escaped on foot through a side trail after the broadcast tower incident, but the noise behind them hadn't stopped. Helicopters buzzed in the distance. Searchlights swept across the trees. But the file upload was done. The truth was out there now. What do you think happens next? Richard asked as they ducked behind a row of dumpsters beside a gas station. Tessa wiped sweat from her brow. We wait, we watch. If that footage reaches the public, there'll be a storm. And if it gets buried, then we make more noise. They needed a car. Across the road, an old green minivan was parked beside a diner. The driver, a teenage kid, sat inside eating fries, watching something on his phone. Tessa checked her gun, then tapped Richard. Distraction? Richard nodded. He walked into the diner, approached the counter, and loudly asked the cashier, Is that your car outside? I think someone just hit it. The kid in the van looked up and immediately ran out to check. That was all Tessa needed. She opened the passenger door and climbed in. When the kid realized nothing was wrong, it was too late. Richard was already in the driver's seat. I'm sorry about this, he said, and they sped off down the road. They drove west, sticking to small roads and avoiding cities. The news hadn't broken yet. The upload had finished, but if someone at the top had pulled the plug before it reached public channels, it would all be for nothing. Tessa kept refreshing a secure browser on her burner phone. Still offline, she muttered. Then she checked again. Her eyes widened. Wait, here it is. She handed the phone to Richard. Headline, Secret flight recording leaked voices heard moments before crash. It was already trending. The voice of Captain Morrow, the phrase "execute protocol," the screams. It was all over the internet now, millions of views, people questioning, demanding answers. Richard felt a cold shiver run down his back. "We did it," he whispered. Tessa didn't smile. "This is the beginning, not the end." That night, they stopped at a run-down motel off Highway 12. No cameras, no check-in. They paid cash and used fake names. Inside the small room, Richard stared at himself in the mirror. He looked like a ghost of the man who boarded that plane weeks ago. Dirt-streaked face, bandaged side, haunted eyes. He turned to Tessa, who sat on the bed, rifle close. "You ever think we won't make it?" he asked. She looked at him. Every second? He nodded slowly. Same. There was a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Another knock. Then a voice, calm, low. "Richard Hyde. You've made quite the mess." Richard raised his gun. Tessa stepped to the side of the door, silent. Then the door was kicked open. A flashbang rolled in. Boom. White light. Richard hit the floor. Ears ringing. Tessa fired blindly through the smoke, dropping one figure in the doorway. Another charged in. Richard shot him in the leg, then wrestled him to the ground, slamming his head against the bed frame. He looked up. 2 more were in the room. Too late. But suddenly a blast of gunfire ripped through the window behind them. Someone was shooting from outside. One of the attackers dropped instantly. The last turned to run, but a bullet caught him clean through the neck. The room fell silent. Tessa coughed and staggered toward the window. Outside, a man stepped into view. Older, tall, bald with a gray goatee. He wore a long coat and held a smoking rifle. "Name's Travis," he said. "I'm here to help." They packed up fast. Travis drove a black SUV that looked too clean to be local. He tossed a file on the seat beside Richard. "Word is you leaked something hot," he said. "Big enough that some folks upstairs are panicking. That's when you know you did something right." Richard opened the folder. Inside were photos of more downed flights, other crashes no one had talked about. One was dated 1994. Another in 2002. "How do you have this?" Richard asked. Travis smirked. "Let's just say you're not the only one who's been digging." He looked at Tessa. "You're ex-field intel, right? Kicked out after a botched operation in Morocco?" Tessa narrowed her eyes. "You've been watching me." "Not watching. Waiting. I figured someone would eventually get smart enough to fight back. That day's here." Richard leaned forward. "We need to find Morrow." "I know," Travis said. "And I've got something that might help." He handed Richard a photo. Grainy, taken from a distance. It was Captain Morrow. He was alive, and sitting in the back of a limousine, walking into a private air hangar in Nevada 2 days ago. "Where?" Richard asked. "Restricted facility. Military clearance, no way in without dying." Richard looked at Tessa. She smiled grimly. "Then we better figure out how to die without dying." They drove all night again, through barren deserts and empty highways. By dawn, they had eyes on the facility. It sat behind a long chain of fences, surrounded by towers and lights. A private airfield for high-level government transport. Security was tight, guards with rifles, black SUVs, surveillance cameras every 20 feet. But Richard saw something else, weak points. A drainage tunnel leading beneath the outer wall. A gap between shift changes where the back gate wasn't manned. "We sneak in one shot," Travis said. "We get tomorrow, we make him talk. And we broadcast it live," Richard nodded. "Then let's do it." They prepared for hours, watching every movement. Tessa rewired the drone feed using a hijacked laptop, looping 5 minutes of old footage so they wouldn't be spotted sneaking in. At midnight, they made their move. They crawled through the drainage tunnel, water-cold and black. They emerged inside the fence, soaked but unseen. Richard, Tessa, and Travis moved like ghosts, hugging shadows, avoiding lights. They reached the hangar. It was massive. A private jet sat on the far end of the runway, waiting. Inside, guards talked casually until one turned and saw them. Tessa fired first, quick, clean. The guard dropped. The others shouted, but Richard was already inside, cutting through the hallway, gun raised. At the far end was a secure door. Behind it, Captain Morrow. Face older, body heavier, but the same man from the photos. Richard burst in. Morrow raised his hand slowly. "You're a long way from dead, Mr. Hyde." Richard stepped closer. You're going to tell the world what really happened on that flight. Morrow smiled faintly. You have no idea what you've stepped into. Richard pressed the gun to his forehead. Start talking. Captain Morrow sat completely still, hands raised, eyes locked with Richard's. The gun didn't shake in Richard's hand. He had waited too long for this moment. You're going to tell the truth, Richard said calmly. And this time, the world is listening. Morrow looked past him, then slowly lowered his hands. There are things you don't understand, he said. You're in way over your head. Richard didn't blink. I've been to the crash site, I've seen the tapes. I've seen the files, and I heard your voice right before the plane went down. Morrow's jaw clenched. I didn't kill those people. No. Tessa stepped into the room, rifle raised. Because it sounded a lot like you signed off on their deaths. Morrow slowly turned his head toward her, studying her face. You're field-trained. Who do you work for? Tessa didn't answer. Travis entered behind her, shutting the door and locking it. Time's short, Travis said. Guards will realize something's wrong soon. Get what we came for. Richard stepped closer. What was Flight 1678 really about? He asked. Morrow looked tired now. His voice came out low and even. It was a live test. For what? Richard asked. Tracking civilian response in controlled crashes. Government tech disguised as commercial flights. The goal was to test a new predictive threat response system. Artificial scenario, full civilian occupancy. Real-time panic metrics. You used real passengers to crash test a project? Tessa snapped. Morrow met her glare without flinching. They were meant to be sedated. Richard gripped the gun tighter. We weren't. Something failed, Morrow said. One of the systems. I was supposed to be extracted minutes before the descent. But I didn't leave. I stayed on board until the final 2 minutes. That's a lie, Richard snapped. You were nowhere near that wreck. I jumped. Mid-descent, they pulled me out with a tethered chute. Tessa stepped forward. And everyone else? You let them die. Morrow looked down. I didn't design the system. I just flew the plane. Richard stepped back, breathing hard. He wanted to shoot the man, but they needed more. Why cover it up, he asked. Why bury it for 20 years? Because it was part of a bigger pattern, Morrow said quietly. 1678 was one of 11 flights. Different carriers, different routes. Same endgame. What was the endgame? Travis asked. Behavior modeling, Morrow said. They wanted to know how people would respond in crises. What decisions they'd make, who'd fight, who'd freeze, who'd sacrifice. The data helped shape national emergency protocols. Richard's stomach turned. You're telling me we were test subjects? Morrow nodded. You could have warned us, Tessa said. You could have said something before takeoff. I signed something, Morrow said. Something that doesn't let you sleep at night. Richard stepped back. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small body camera. He'd activated it the second they entered the room. You've been recorded this whole time. Morrow looked up. A small sad smile spread across his face. Doesn't matter. It will, Richard said. We'll broadcast it. Not from here, Travis said suddenly. The lights flickered, then alarms blared. Time's up, Tessa muttered. Gunfire echoed from outside the hangar. Red lights spun across the walls. Get ready, Travis yelled. He kicked open the hangar side door. Back route now. Richard grabbed Morrow by the collar. You're coming with us. The captain didn't fight. They burst into the night. Guards were already converging on the area, shouting and fanning out with weapons drawn. Tessa led the charge down a narrow maintenance path behind the hangar. This way, fence ahead. Bullets tore through the air. Sparks flew off the metal barrels near them. Travis returned fire, covering the retreat. They reached the fence. Richard turned to Morrow. I'm 55, the pilot shouted. Climb or die, he climbed. Tessa helped boost him. Richard followed, then Travis last, firing 2 quick shots that dropped a guard near the corner watch light. On the other side of the fence, they ran toward a black truck Travis had stashed earlier behind a mound of rocks. As soon as they jumped in, Tessa slammed the pedal. The engine roared and the truck sped off through the desert, bouncing over rocks and sand. Gunfire chased them. A bullet cracked the back window. Another struck the rear tire. They veered left but kept moving. An hour later, deep into the desert, the truck finally coasted to a stop near an old weather tower. Carl's mobile van was already there, lights off, laptop on. "We got it," Travis said, pulling the door open. Richard handed Carl the body cam. "Full confession, on video." Carl plugged it in. The file loaded. Morrow's voice filled the van. Carl's eyes widened. "This will burn half the people in Washington." Richard looked at Morrow, who sat quietly, staring out into the dark. "Why'd you really stay on the plane?" Richard asked. The pilot didn't respond. Carl leaned back. "We push this now, there's no walking it back." "Push it," Tessa said. Carl clicked upload. The screen lit up, transmitting to all live feeds, 3%, 12%, 24%. Suddenly, headlights appeared on the horizon. Tires, engines, black vehicles. At least 3. They tracked us. Tessa yelled. Carl yanked the drive and stuffed it into a sealed case. "We'll have to move again." But Richard didn't move. He stepped out of the van, gun in hand. "They won't stop unless we stop them." Tessa grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" We finished this, the first SUV skidded to a stop. Armed men poured out. Richard opened fire first, taking cover behind a rock formation. Tessa flanked left, rifle blasting. Travis threw a smoke grenade. It hissed and filled the air with a white fog. The second SUV screeched as it slid on gravel. It slammed into a boulder and flipped sideways. More gunshots. Travis dropped one attacker with a clean shot between the eyes. Carl took the drive and ran toward the hills, staying low, moving fast. "Cover Carl," Richard shouted. Morrow ducked in the van, hands over his head. Tessa moved to higher ground and picked off 2 more men. Gunfire echoed like thunder. Then, Richard stood slowly. Bodies lay in the dirt, smoke curled into the night. Carl's voice came over the radio. "Upload complete, full confession aired." "It's everywhere," Tessa exhaled. "We did it," but Richard didn't smile. Morrow still sat quietly in the van, staring at the blood on his hands. And though the world now knew the truth, Richard knew this wasn't the end. It was just the first time the people were watching. And now someone was going to have to answer for it. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. The confession had gone public. Morrow's voice had hit the internet like wildfire. Every major news outlet ran the story. Social media exploded with the video. It was already being called one of the greatest government cover-ups of the last 50 years. But for Richard, Tessa, and Travis, it wasn't over. They had no idea how many other people were involved in those test flights. How many others had been buried in reports or left in wreckage no one was allowed to examine. The truth was out now, yes, but the rest of the game had just begun. For their safety, they went dark. Tessa vanished into the Midwest, staying off-grid. Richard changed his name again, slipped across state lines, and started working as a truck mechanic in a town so small it didn't even have a stoplight. He wanted peace, but peace never came. 20 years after the crash of Flight 1678, in a rural town called Allen's Bend, a storm rolled through. One of the worst in decades. Roads flooded. Power lines went down. The river overflowed and dragged mud and debris across half the farmland in the area. When the water finally receded, the land looked different. Deep gashes ran through the soil. Trees had been pulled from their roots. One farmer, Hank Rudd, was walking the edge of his backfield when he noticed something strange sticking out from the side of a newly formed gully. It looked like a piece of aluminum. He dug around it, pulling away mud and debris, until he uncovered what looked like the edge of a metal crate. The hinges were rusted, but the box hadn't completely collapsed. Inside, wrapped in soaked plastic and foam, were papers. Military stamps, FAA tags, and a small sealed envelope with a red sticker on it that said, "For RH only Hank wasn't a curious man." But this time, curiosity got the better of him. He opened the envelope. Inside was a folded note. It read, "Don't trust the pilot. He didn't sleep that night." The next morning, Hank called the only person he knew might understand, his cousin, who used to work in Air Force storage records. The cousin drove out the next day. One look at the files and his face went pale. "You don't know what you just found," he told Hank. "I ain't read the rest," Hank replied. "Didn't feel like it was for me." Together, they spread the papers out in Hank's barn. Most of them were damp, but some were still readable. One had a full manifest, Flight 1678, passenger list marked all deceased. But one name had a red line through it, Richard Hyde, status. Unconfirmed, another sheet detailed the route of a secondary chopper flight. Extraction path be 12 miles south of initial descent. That wasn't in any report. There were more notes, field maps, strange schedules, coordination charts. Someone had documented everything, down to the last minute. But the most shocking piece was a photo, dated 3 days after the crash. It showed a man in a hospital bed, tubes in his nose, bandage across his chest. The name at the bottom, R. Hyde, the pilot had told everyone Richard died in the crash. But this photo proved otherwise. Hank's cousin folded the papers again. These were never supposed to be found. 2 weeks later, a journalist named Mara Finn showed up in Allen's Bend. She was known for digging up deep stories no one else wanted to touch. Hank didn't trust reporters, but she showed him photos. She already had the leaked confession from Morrow. She was building something bigger. When she saw the box Hank found, she didn't even blink. She just said, "This is the missing piece." She asked him for one thing, to take her to where he found it. They walked across the broken land. At the edge of the ravine, she stood still, scanning the dirt and rocks. "What are you looking for?" Hank asked. "Any sign that someone else already found this place," she said. Hank frowned. "You think they're watching?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took out her camera and began recording. Meanwhile, Richard was in New Mexico, working under the name Dave Lindley. His hair had gone gray at the sides, and he had a quiet rhythm to his life, morning coffee, tools in hand, radio playing old rock songs. Then a letter arrived, no return address. Just one line written inside, "Farmer found the box. Stories coming back." Richard nearly dropped his coffee. He locked the garage, took the letter into the bathroom, and burned it in the sink. It had been 20 years. He had seen enough horror to last a lifetime, but something told him it wasn't over. So he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He made a call. It rang only once, then Tessa's voice came through. Older, tougher, but still her. "You saw the letter," she said. "Yes," Richard said. "What do we do?" "Meet me in Denver, same motel." Then she hung up. Back in Allen's Bend, Mara worked through the night. She scanned every file, piecing together the timeline, matching it against the original crash report, the black box data, and Morrow's confession. Something didn't line up. According to these new documents, Flight 1678 wasn't just one test. It was the final test, the last of a series. And it failed, not because the plane went down, but because someone survived, someone they couldn't control. By the time Richard arrived in Denver, the motel parking lot was already full of unmarked cars. He knew what that meant. Someone else had seen the footage. Someone else wanted to stop it from reaching the next level. He slipped into the back alley, took the emergency stairwell to the second floor, and knocked once. Tessa opened the door. She had aged well. Lines around her eyes, same steady fire in her stare. "You look like crap," she said. "I've been sleeping in a garage for a decade." They sat across from each other. Tessa pushed a folder toward him. "Someone left this at a drop point yesterday." Inside were recent surveillance photos. 2 men in suits, standing at the original crash site. One was pointing toward the same ravine, the flood exposed. "They're looking for the box," she said. "They don't know we already have it?" Richard asked. "No, but they know it exists." He exhaled. "What now?" Tessa leaned in. "There's a name I never told you. A man who wrote the original test parameters. The one who created the idea for the civilian panic model. Morrow didn't even know his full name." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And he's still alive?" The man's name was Dr. Ellis Brent. Tessa had dug deep to find it through scrubbed databases, deleted contractor logs, and hidden security clearances. Brent wasn't a pilot or a soldier or a public figure. He was a systems engineer who worked behind locked doors, designing programs no one was supposed to know existed. And he was the one who created the flight protocol that led to the crash of Flight 1678. He wasn't just the architect, Tessa told Richard as they rode a train through Denver's underbelly. He was the reason the experiment happened in the first place. "Why?" Richard asked. "What was worth all those lives?" She opened a small laptop and tapped a few keys. A diagram appeared on screen titled Pulse Panic Utilization for Live Simulation Experiments. Controlled environments manipulated behavior patterns, she said. They believed that with enough real panic data, they could predict future threats. It was all about using terror to build better control systems. Richard clenched his jaw. So they used innocent people as test rats. Tessa nodded, and Brent made the maze. They found him in a remote home outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Brent lived alone, no guards, no cameras. Just an old man with a garden and a mailbox that hadn't seen mail in years. But Tessa wasn't fooled. Places like this look quiet because the noise is underground, she muttered. They parked 2 streets away and moved in on foot. It was just past 8 p.m. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. Richard checked his pistol. Tessa carried the same rifle she'd used 20 years ago. They crept to the back door, unlocked. Inside, the place was spotless. No pictures, no family photos, no sign of guests. Just walls lined with file cabinets, screens, and one large desk in the middle of the room. And behind it Ellis Brent. He was thin, pale, hair almost white, but his eyes were sharp, cold, and alert. He didn't flinch when Richard stepped in. "I've been waiting," Brent said. "You know who we are?" Tessa asked. Brent gave a small nod. "Of course, I helped build your files." Richard stepped closer. "Then you know what we want?" "You want the truth," Brent said quietly. "But it's not going to feel good." Tessa didn't blink. "Say it anyway." Brent folded his hands. Pulse wasn't a rogue experiment. It wasn't just the military. It was signed off by 3 countries, 2 corporations, and 8 departments within the U.S. government. The plane crash you survived, that wasn't the first. It was just the first one that went wrong. He turned his chair slightly and opened a drawer. Tessa raised her weapon instantly. Brent held up his hands. "Just papers." He pulled out a red folder and tossed it on the table. Inside were blueprints, emails, flight logs, all marked with seals from private defense contractors. Some of them dated as far back as 1978. Richard stared. "This was going on that long?" Brent nodded. "And every person who asked questions, vanished, was paid off, or buried under national security tags." He paused, then looked at Richard directly. "You were supposed to die, but when they realized you hadn't, they erased you instead." Tessa narrowed her eyes. "And the others who survived?" Brent shook his head. "There were none." Silence filled the room. Then Brent leaned back. "But you already knew that, didn't you? You've carried that weight for 20 years. Richard stared at him. "You killed 187 people and walked away clean." Brent looked almost tired. "I didn't kill anyone. I built the framework. They executed the plan." "No difference," Tessa said, stepping forward. "You watched the results and did nothing." "That's where you're wrong," Brent said quietly. "I kept one thing hidden." He stood slowly and moved to a locked cabinet behind his desk. This time Richard raised his gun. Brent didn't argue. He simply opened it and pulled out a sealed black case. Inside was a cassette tape, old, dusty. He placed it on the desk. "This is the original cockpit voice recording," Brent said. "Not the one you leaked. This one never left this room." Richard frowned. "The one we uploaded was edited," Brent said. "Trimmed to leave out the part where someone tried to stop the descent." Tessa's eyes narrowed. "Someone tried to abort the crash?" Brent nodded. 35 seconds before impact. It wasn't Morrow. It was the co-pilot, James Kyla. He realized what was happening, tried to override the system. They fought. The autopilot locked him out. He paused. "He died trying to save you." Richard stepped back slowly, swallowing hard. That part had never been in any report. Not even the black box data they found years ago. Brent looked at them both. "You survived because he changed the angle. That's why the tail hit first. That's why you were pulled out alive." For a long time no one spoke. Then Richard looked at Tessa. "We released this, all of it," Tessa nodded. Brent held up a small drive. "I've already digitized it. Take it, burn the house, burn me, but make sure they can't hide anymore." The next day, the fire department in Flagstaff reported a total house fire on the edge of town. No survivors, 'cause unknown. But across the country, every major news network began playing the full cockpit audio from Flight 1678. and in the background a voice cried, "They're overriding the descent. We have passengers on board. This isn't right. This isn't right." Then silence. Then impact. The public exploded. Protests, hearings, names were exposed, CEOs, generals, contractors, lawsuits filed. Families reopened their grief. Some people got arrested, some vanished. But the secret was no longer a secret. And somewhere, in a rented home outside Kansas City, Richard Hyde watched it all on TV. He didn't smile. But for the first time, he didn't feel hunted. Tessa called later that night. "You all right?" she asked. "I will be," Richard said. "Took long enough." There was a pause. Then she said, "You saw the farmer, right?" "Yeah." "The note, yeah. Don't trust the pilot." Richard looked out the window at the empty street below. "You think someone else is still out there?" he asked. Tessa didn't answer right away. Then, "There's always another name. But this time, they're going to think twice." Click, call ended. Richard stared at the ceiling. No ghosts, no monsters, just men. And for once, the world had seen what they were truly capable of. If you liked this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, another to strengthen our community, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.